Hi, my name is Patrick Vaughn. I am a Presbyterian pastor, and today Terrell Carter and I are going to discuss race relations in the United States. Terrell, could you please introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, thank you for having me as part of this conversation again. I'm Terrell Carter. I am a pastor in St. Louis, Missouri. I am the pastor of a Baptist church, but I'm also an educational administrator or an administrator in higher education in Greenville, Illinois, and I'm also a former police officer for the city of St. Louis.
Great, thank you. I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and I am interested in race relations. And as you are able to tell, I'm white, and Terrell is black. And we're going to have an open, free-flowing conversation about what's going on in our society today. Terrell, I can't get that image of George Floyd out of my mind. And when I see him there, I feel disgust and fear and sadness. But I imagine that your feelings might be different. And I'm wondering how you're feeling when you see that image again and again on television.
I have made myself stop watching television or stop looking at that image because there's so much frustration and disgust. There's an irony to this situation. You and I began to have these conversations almost 4 years ago under the same type of circumstances where Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. So my initial feeling was, here we go again. We're going to experience this all over again.
Deja vu in the worst sort of way.
Yeah.
Does it seem like it's just never ending to you?
It does. This is a never-ending cycle of how police respond and it's how minority communities are treated. There's a saying that people have been using as part of this discussion that this is not the first time a black man has been killed at the hands of police. This is just the most recent time that it was caught on tape or that's been recorded. From our conversations 4 years ago, I said something similar that this may be new to the white church, this may be new to certain white populations, but this is something that is experienced by African Americans on a daily basis. So it was not a surprise to any of us. The surprise for me has been how many white people have actually, have I don't want to say joined the fight, that's the wrong way of phrasing it, but have decided to say that no, enough is enough. We have to do something about this. The question is, will people stick with this long term versus just the immediacy of seeing how horrible the act was by the Minneapolis police officer, but be willing to stick with it long term?
Protests have emerged all around the world, and I'm surprised at the number of people that have come out, the number of protests that we have. And when I look at the crowds online or on television, they're white, black, brown, young, old. Something about this experience, about this image of his murder, seems to have touched people in a way that others have not. Does that resonate with you in some way?
In some way it does, but then again, let me say it this way. I have tried to understand what is different about this particular incident versus the ones that happened previously. And I think that just the sheer 8 minutes of police force against someone who could not do anything, who was not fighting, it's what shocked people and moved people so much. So with Michael Brown, 4 years ago, the argument could be made that Michael Brown was a thug who had just, or the argument was being made that Michael Brown was a thug who was fighting against police. And when you fight against police, you get what you deserved. The gentleman in New York who had been selling cigarettes on the sidewalk, who was arrested by police, and he's the first "I can't breathe" that our nation experienced. You could say that, okay, he was such a big guy and he was not cooperating with the police. That's why it took 3 to 4 of them, and it was such a fast reaction that everything occurred so quickly. But again, this time, 8 minutes of sustained police force on someone who was not resisting. I think that made it hard for anyone to push back against, and it made it acceptable for people who usually would not protest to join in this to protest and join.
he was in such a vulnerable position.
Right.
He said he couldn't breathe, and he called out for his mother even in desperation.
Right.
The cruelty of that. I don't think there are words to describe it.
There aren't, but again, you and I have talked about this several years ago. Many people don't understand this, but those are the tactics that police use on a regular basis. You are taught how to physically restrain someone, not like that, but you are taught to physically restrain someone. But when you are out on the street, all that training kind of goes out of the window, and you do what you have to do, or what you feel like you can do in order to control someone. So people have asked me when I was in the academy, when I was on the street, was I taught to do things like that? And I was not taught to do that in the academy. But when you get on the street, you go by the rules of the street and the rules of the older officers who have been there for a while. And for many of them, that kind of action is acceptable. And if you don't follow their lead on those things, then you are ostracized and potentially left out on your own as a younger officer.
What first drew you to law enforcement?
I was about to be a dad. My wife was pregnant, and I had a job that was not paying very well. I didn't have any benefits, and literally I prayed, God, I need a job to be able to take care of my family. 2 days later, I heard an advertisement, a promotion on the radio for the police department in St. Louis. And my immediate response was, God, this cannot be an answer to prayer. But it turned out to be an answer to prayer. I ended up applying, or I had a friend whose father was a police officer, and contacted him and just told him what my situation was, and asked him for his advice. And he gave me some very clear advice that this could be a very good opportunity for me. It would help me be able to take care of my family, but I had to be ready for the challenges that came along with it. And I had to weigh all of that with who I thought I was trying to become as a man, and decide whether I would be able to live with that. And I applied and got in.
Before you went to the academy, as a young black man growing up, what was your experience of the police, or your attitude towards law enforcement when you were in your late teens, early 20s?
It was not a good experience. I grew up in a neighborhood that was African American, and we were considered low class by the police. Let me rephrase that. Let me say it in a much clearer way. We grew up with black officers in our community. We grew up with white officers in our community. Black officers treated people in the neighborhood one way. White officers treated people in the neighborhood a different way. And our experiences with the white officers were not positive. So I grew up not liking police. I grew up fearing police. Some of my earliest memories with my mother, I have a twin brother. Some of my earliest memories are me and my twin brother in the backseat of our mother's car, and she would get pulled over because she had a muffler that was too loud. But it was 4 police cars that pulled her over. And this was she was a small woman. Why would it take 4 police officers to pull over the car with just a single black female and 2 kids in it?
Why would it?
I have no idea.
What would be their rationality? Any idea?
No idea. I have no idea. I know that when I was a police officer, you clearly didn't want to stop a car by yourself. If you were a single person in a car, a single officer in a car, you always wanted backup because you never knew what was going to happen. But 4 separate officers was overkill.
When we had our last series of discussions, what impacted me more than anything else was the realization of how different your world was growing up compared to my world. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, I'll look at the police and I go, oh, good, someone's looking after us. Great. we feel a little bit safer. That's a different world. That's a different universe than what you grew up in. I mean, that is just radically different.
Yeah.
And I'm still struck by that. I shouldn't be at this point, but.
Well, but that's not your fault, though. I mean, it's not your, and as you know, I don't blame anyone in particular like that. I mean, I clearly look at it systemically, but yeah, no, my children's experience is completely different. My son is 22. He now lives in Atlanta. but he did not have the same experiences, partly because while he was growing up, his father was a police officer, and I was able to protect him and shield him. But when he got older, he became a teenager. I had to have the infamous talk with him and tell him, look, if you ever get pulled over, if you ever get stopped, the first thing you tell them is, my father is Officer Carter and his DSN is such and such, because that would make a police officer stop doing whatever it was they were doing, and they would straighten up, and then they would at least try to call and confirm and try to figure out what's going on with this young man instead of just treating him like a criminal thug and doing anything wrong to him. Now my daughter is 15 and she's growing up, and this is a completely different world for her as well. And when I tell her stories about what it was like to grow up in the time that I grew up in the community, she's amazed because it's like something from TV to her.
So it's very different for her too.
Yep.
When we talked before, you shared some experiences of what it was like to be an African American male getting pulled over by law enforcement. And a couple of those experiences shed a little bit of light, I think, and it might help us to understand what your experience was like. Could you share those again?
I have so many.
I'm sure. Okay, that was a dumb question I just asked, wasn't it?
No, it was not. I'm just trying to think of what would be appropriate.
What one had to do with you were wearing a jacket from the academy?
Yep. Okay. So I live in St. Louis, and one of the suburbs is Webster Groves, and I serve as pastor in Webster Groves. But while I was in the police academy, I was driving down the highway that connects, that goes through the suburbs, through the city, and I was headed home. And I drove through the city of Webster Groves, and I was pulled over by a police officer. And what that police officer told me was, when I asked him why he stopped me, he said, because you were driving the speed limit. And it's like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to drive the speed limit. And he said, no, anyone who drives the speed limit is up to no good. And I'm like, you can't be serious about this. Yeah, so give me your ID and all your information. I was wearing a police jacket, again, because I was in the academy. And when I reached for my ID, I made sure that he could see the patch, the police department patch on my left shoulder. And as soon as he saw that, it looked like he had seen a ghost. He began to apologize, and he literally begged for forgiveness and asked me not to tell anyone that he had stopped me. And he ran back to his car and just drove away. Again, the question I would have for him is like, why are you pulling me over, and why is driving the speed limit something that's wrong for a Black person to do?
And this was not an unusual experience for you in growing up?
No, I mean, I've told you before, I remember the experience before I was a police officer, I worked in construction, and I remember driving away from a construction site in another affluent St. Louis County or St. Louis municipality. And when I'm driving away from that particular home on a Saturday, I am in full carpenter mode, carpenter clothes, all my tools are in the back seat. A police officer pulls me over as I'm leaving the work site. And so I'm driving one way, police officer's driving the opposite direction. I get to the corner and I see him turn around. I make the turn to go to a main road, and the police officer speeds up behind me, turns his lights on. And when he gets to my car door, I ask him, why did you stop me? He said, because you were speeding. You were going 45 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone, which I was not. But I said, officer, how could you tell that I was going 45 miles when you were going in the opposite direction and I turned a corner and you couldn't even see me? And he said, my traffic radar gun can follow you no matter if you turn corners or if you do something else. And I looked at him and said, are you serious? This cannot be, this is not legitimate. And so I had to tell him the job site that I was at. I had to be able to tell him who he could find at the job site so he could go back and verify that I belonged there. Being pulled over by the police. And I have multiple more stories. Even as I remember one day when I was a police officer, I was on duty with my partner, and we were driving in an unmarked car, or I was driving in our unmarked car. And a police officer, again in Webster Groves, stopped me in my unmarked police car because he said that I had made an illegal movement. But as soon as he walked up to the car, he was like, "Oh no," because he could see my police radio, he could see all the police equipment inside. He's like, "Just go." No, no, I'm not just going. Why did you stop me in the first place? So no, it happened and still happens on a regular basis.
You made reference just a moment ago to the talk, the famous talk. We only have a few more minutes, but I would like to close today. Could you, let's imagine that you're giving me that talk. So what would you say?
I would say, I'll again, the conversation I've had with my son is, you know what, I love you. You were my baby, but let me make sure you understand that not everyone feels like I do about you. When you show up in certain places, people are going to be afraid of you or be suspicious of you just because of what you look like. So you need to be able to understand how to handle yourself in those situations. Don't ever raise your voice. Don't ever move quickly. Don't ever let someone see you get angry, because any of those things will cause them or give them a reason to call the police. And then you'll have to explain. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. They could have disrespected you. They could have done something wrong to you. But as soon as you respond, you are the one that's going to be held accountable. So be aware of the fact that, and understand that people, not everyone, but there's probably going to be multiple people wherever you are going who are going to be afraid of you just because of what you look like, just because of the kind of clothes you're wearing. And do not put yourself in a position where they can call the police on you. And if they do call the police on you, make sure you keep your hands exactly where the police can see you. Make sure the police can always see that your hands are open, so they know that nothing's in your hands. Before you make any kind of movement, before you kind of do anything, tell the police or ask the police based on how aggressive they're being. Tell them or ask them if it's okay for you to get your ID out, if it's okay for you to sit down, if it's okay for you to show them something or explain something to them, because you don't ever want to give them the opportunity to just say that, oh, he made me afraid, and because he made me afraid, I had to respond.
Terrell, I really appreciate your openness, man, your willingness to talk about these issues. And we're calling this scratching the surface because that's really all we're doing at this point, is scratching the surface. And today we've heard a little bit about your experience as a young Black man growing up. Next time, I would like to hear about your experiences as a law enforcement officer and how that might have shaped your understanding of race relations in our society. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Patrick Vaughn, and this has been Terrell Carter. Thank you.
Thank you.